Approximately 50 million people died in 24 famines from 1850 to 1899 in India under the British rule. The Great Famine of 1876 caused a great number of agricultural workers and laborers to move into the British colonies as indentured laborers. Hi, I'm Yolanda, and I'm passionate about educating people about the Indian diaspora, specifically indentured labor, which came about as a replacement for slavery, where the words may have changed, but the practice very much is seen the same. And when you think about the various atrocities in the history of mankind, you think about the Holocaust, which was horrible and should never be repeated. You think about slavery, which was horrible and should never be repeated. But indentureship is not seen in the same light. And I'm here to highlight the awful conditions that my people lived under, and it should be recognized and should never be repeated. So the British abolished slavery in 1834, and indentured labor became a convenient replacement for this wicked system of slavery. But the thing is, why would 1 million plus Indians leave their home, their families, and venture into a dark, unknown world? It's not like they could go Google where they're going or check out TripAdvisor or anything like that. It was dark, it was unknown, and they could only trust the word of the very people that occupied their land. But how did we get to a place where the British occupied India? Let me take you back to the days of the Silk Road. I'm not talking about Silk Road 2.0, the online version. I'm talking about the real Silk Road, which was basically a trade route that expanded from China all the way across India, over into the Middle East, parts of Eastern Europe, and eventually Western Europe. So it's not just one road, it's multiple directions that people traveled. But what happened was, somebody in China would travel to some bazaar, and they were merchants, and they would sell their goods on the retail side, on the bulk side, and then the buyer from there, maybe he'd go to another bazaar further down the line on the Silk Road. And this is how trade happened along the Silk Road. And when that trade happened, it wasn't just goods and trinkets and some gems that were exchanged. Language was exchanged, culture was exchanged, food was exchanged, disease was also exchanged. And we know from history, with the various rise and fall of kings, powers, and governments that controlled various areas, and parts of the Silk Road were controlled by various establishments at that point. And the sudden end to the Silk Road came with the rise of the Ottoman Empire, and that's basically in modern-day Turkey, and that's the connecting point between East and the West. And when that point fell, the Silk Road fell with it. And it's more the West that wanted goods from the East than the other way around, so my research tells me. So the West, the Western powers, they needed to find an alternate route to get to the East, to get to India, to get to China, to trade with these partners. We come to the point of the voyages of discovery. You might remember this from school, or the ages of discovery, where the Western colonial powers went out, conquered, occupied, and did what they did best. And eventually, we had the East India Company occupying India, which is an expanded version of what we know modern-day India as. And then we also had the Crown take over from the East India Company in the mid-1800s or so. Bottom line is, India was an occupied land, and the people were oppressed. And with that occupation came plunder, where they plundered the land, they plundered the resources, and people being one of those resources of the land of India as well. They set high taxes for the Indians. They made huge demands on the production side in terms of agriculture that the average Indian just could not meet. Remember, India is such a diverse place, diverse landscapes, and they're known for annual monsoons, periods of heavy drought, and in an agricultural place like India, where people could not perform their duties according to their natural ability, but to serve a slave master, there was no equilibrium. If you farmed wheat in one season, your excess, you take it and you'd save it away for a time. You know where the drought will come, or the floods will come, or something will come to disturb your crops. And then you have your surplus, your backup, your savings that you can use to sustain your family, to sustain your community. But this is not the case for India, because they were occupied. All excess had to go to the British. The British shipped it off to the other colonies and back to Britain. A recent study that was published by Columbia University Press equated that almost 200 years of plunder, 45 trillion US dollars were taken from India. And that's just the material stuff, not the emotional scarring, the brutality, the emotional side of being occupied. And because of those high requirements the British required of the Indians, famines came about where there was not enough grain to sustain the population. 18th, 19th, 20th century, it is said that over 50 million Indians died during over 31 famines in the subcontinent. In my opinion, there are two factors that led to famine. One is high taxes, and two is the high demand in production that the British required. Between 1792 and 1900, there were numerous famines on the subcontinent. But during those time of famine, there seemed to be no impact on the tax revenue collected by the British. The bulk of the taxes came in the form of land revenue. There are also indirect taxes as well, taxes on customs. There was a wheel tax in Bombay, the ever popular salt tax that Mahatma Gandhi was protesting against in the early to mid 1900s. So Britain had a monopoly on salt in India. They had the exclusive manufacturing and distribution of salt, and nobody could purchase or manufacture or be involved in the salt trade in any way. You had to exclusively buy it from the British. And if you know anything about salt, your body needs it. You can't live without it. It flavors food. It's a necessity. And you had to buy it from the British. And obviously, they had some British prices on that as well. One of the things that really broke the poor in India during colonialization was the high demand in production that the British had. The demands of the agricultural output system led many into poverty, and those that are really poor were forced to stay in that rut because the demand for agricultural production was so high. Before British rule, the farmers could store away their surplus for a rainy day. However, this is not the case in colonial Britain, where the surplus goods had to be sold to Britain at paltry prices, and they did what they did best, sent it to the various colonies at premium prices, sent it back to England at premium prices, leaving the original manufacturer of the product, the Indians, with basically nothing. Add those high taxes on top of that, and it led to an environment that was basically unbearable. So now, to fulfill this demand placed by the British, surplus had to go. And ironically, during the Great Famine, the one in 1878, there was a consistent level of rice export despite the need in India. From 1873 to 1878, there were drastic increases in the exportation of rice. Even during the Great Famine, there was a rice export increase of 14% from the previous year, while the people of India starved. I will be packing more of our ancestors' journey here. With more than 50 million dead and $45 trillion taken from India, there are a lot more questions to be asked, and I hope to find you the answers.